Hello and welcome to the another lecture in veterinary anatomy brainry, and today we'll be discussing the bones of skull. Some bones of the skull we'll be discussing. So in front of you can see this the skull of ox, and this skull forms the bony framework for the head, and lodges many organs it lodges the brain, then parts of respiratory system, parts of digestive system, then sense organs. Some sense organs are also lodged in this skull, and besides lodging these many organs, this skull will also provide the attachment to the different kinds of the muscles. You have the very important muscles of the mastication, it will provide the attachment for that. And the bones that are present in the skull are usually joined by one type of immovable type of joints, and comes in the classification of the sutures. So you can see here the bones that are joined here, these are the different types of the sutures present between the bones. And sometimes in these sutures, so you take the example, this is the frontal bone and this is the nasal bone, and sometimes you have in some sutures here, if you name the suture, this will be the frontonasal suture. So small bones will be present here in this suture, what you call as vermian bones or sutural bones. And the bones of the skull generally forms are categorized into two ways. One, the bones that forms the boundaries for the cranial cavity, you call them as a neurocranium. Then the bones that are concerned with that face and other parts, you call that as splanchocranium. So neurocranium, where the it gets formed, where the neural this cranial cavity is formed, and the brain resides there. And different animals has a different shapes of the skull, that depends upon whether how these bones are oriented in the skull. So if you take the example, in case of the dogs, you have the dogs with the different types of the head. You have the dog that is where this splanchocranium, that means the face bones are generally elongated, or the face is elongated, or conic, or it is very elongated, and you call them as a dolichocephalic breeds. Then there are the dog heads where the width is more and the length is less. You have the example of those dogs as you call as brachycephalics. You have the bulldog, you have the pugs as the brachycephalics, you have the dolichocephalics as greyhound or collie. Then you have the breeds of the dog where that comes in between of dolichocephalic and the brachiocephalic, and you have the example of dachshund, or you have fox terrier. And if you compare the head of the animals or animals with that of the head of humans, generally for animals the neurocranial part is little shorter as compared to that of the splachnocranium. But for us, in case of the humans, the neurocranium is bigger as compared to that of the splachnocranium, because this big is face. In case of animals, we have the big cranial cavity as compared to that of the face. So in front of you, as I told you, this is the skull of ox, and the cranium of or the skull of ox usually generally have 35 bones. So some bones will be in the pairs. You have this bone, you can see this is the frontal bone. So this is in the pair. You have here the lacrimals, you have the nasals, you have the zygomatics, you have the maxilla. So these bones basically, and some other bones, you have parietal, you have temporal, acts in are in the pairs. But there are some of the bones which are single. You have the example of the interparietal here, and you have the example of the occipital, that is the back side of the head. They are the single bones. So 35 bones are there present in the skull, and this also includes the bones of the ear, what you call as ear ossicles. In the last video we have shown you the ear ossicles here. I have just put them in one epoxy resin. I have just here you can see they are in the epoxy resins. And this is the malus, these two are the incus, and this is the stapes. So this is from last time we have dissected out on the skull of sheep, and from the skull of sheep we have dissected this malus, and this is stapes, and these are incusses, two incusses. Generally three are there, so this one more incus here from the other here. So altogether six ear ossicles, three on this side, three on that side. Plus there will be one more bone where the tongue will be there, that will give the support to the tongue here, and that you call as a hyoid bone. So hyoid bone, six ossicles, and other bones altogether there will be the 35 bones in the skull of ox. So today we'll be discussing some of the bones and then we'll be comparing with the other species. So if you talk the first bone that we'll be discussing is this bone. So this is the frontal bone and this is in the pair. This is the one frontal bone. So this is the left frontal bone, this is the right frontal bone. And they are joined here by this is called as interfrontal suture. And when you classify this interfrontal suture, this comes in the classification of suture serrata. And the feature of this bone is that it has been divided. It has the three parts. One part is this big part, what you call as the frontal part, or what you call as the body. Then the part of this frontal bone will go towards the orbit here. So this is the orbit. So the medial surface of the orbit is formed by the part of the frontal bone. This is called as orbital palate. And part of this frontal bone will go towards this fossa. This is the fossa, what you call as the temporal fossa. And you can see that here this part is what you call as temporal plate. So temporal plate, the body or the frontal part, and the orbital part, these are the three parts of this frontal bone. So the body or the frontal part has a feature that there is a one uh, there is one canal that you call as a supraorbit, because it's the orbit. Above orbit there is a one canal, this is called the supraorbital canal. Then this supraorbital canal will lead to one foramen here that you call as a supraorbital foramen. So this is the feature of the this bigger part, what you call as the frontal part. And this supraorbital foramen, if you see in case of pig and in case of dog, this supraorbital foramen is absent in case of pig and in case of dog. So you can see clearly. So this is the supraorbital foramen. So this is present absent in case of pig and in case of dog. Now if you remove this frontal bone, what you see here the cranial cavity, that means this bone forms the roof of the cranial cavity, plus you will find one a big opening or the sinus there, what you call the frontal sinus. So this will also frontal sinus will be also present in this frontal bone in case of ox. Then if you see these here, if you see this suture line here and you draw one line here, you will see here one angle is made. This is called as a caudomedial angle. So this bone is also forming a caudomedial angle. This bone is forming a caudomedial angle. Here they are forming one bony elevation. This is called as a torus frontalis. So this is a torus frontalis and this is the highest point of the skull. So this is the highest point of the skull. So caudomedial angle. If you go to the lateral side here, so this is the caudolateral angle. So caudolateral angle, it will have a large conical process. You will see this is a large conical process, and this large conical process basically the horn core. So this is the horn core. So horn core comes from the frontal bone. So any damage to this horn core at the time of fighting between the different types of the animals, and one should know that this is just near to that of the brain, and here also the sinus will be frontal sinus will be here. So damage should not be, any fracture should not be here. That will automatically go towards that infection, or any damage will automatically go towards the cranial cavity or some damage to the frontal sinus. So this is about the frontal part or the body. Now you come to the orbital part. So this is the orbital part. So orbital part forms the medial boundary and this orbital part at the medial side you will have the opening, because this is the opening of the supraorbital foramen. So supraorbital foramen's other opening is on this side, and together they form a canal, what you call as a supraorbital canal. So this is the other opening of supraorbital foramen. Besides also it will also have one more opening here. You can see here this is one more opening here. So this is this opening. This is the ethmoid foramen. So ethmoid foramen, you can see it is on the medial wall that is generally formed by the orbital plate of the frontal bone. So ethmoid foramen also there. Now if you come to here, so this is the temporal palate. So temporal palate is generally it is very short. Temporal palate is generally very short, and you can see here temporal plate. So this is whole is a temporal fossa. So the upper part of temporal fossa, one of the bone is formed by the temporal part of the frontal bone. You can see here, and this is basically the temporal line. So this is basically, so the frontal part is this is the temporal part, and the line of separation between the frontal part is called as a temporal line. Then if you see here, this is the orbit. So this is the caudal margin of the orbit. So the caudal margin of the orbit usually generally is formed, a part of this is also given by the frontal bone. You can see here, this is the zygomatic. So zygomatic, when it reach here, it divides into two processes. One process go towards the upside and one process go towards the back side. So this half of this caudal boundary of the orbit is basically formed by the zygomatic bone, and half of from here to here is provided by the frontal bone. So this process from here to here is called as a frontal process of zygomatic bone, and this process from here to here is called as a zygomatic process of the frontal bone. Together, this frontal process and the zygomatic processes, these together will form the caudal boundary of the orbit. So this is about the frontal bone in case of ox. So if you look out the frontal bone in case of other species, so this is the frontal bone in case of horse. Now you see the frontal bone is, so this is the frontal bone, two frontal bones, this is that suture. So one frontal bone is this, one is this. So two frontal bones, and this frontal bone is somewhat situated rostally, it is towards the nose. You see this is the nose here, somewhat situated towards the nose. And the biggest difference is that if you look out here, the presence of the supraorbital foramen. So supraorbital foramen is basically present in case of horse at the root of or at the beginning of this zygomatic process of frontal. You see here the presence of supraorbital foramen, and if you compare it with that of ox, you see in case of ox it is very far away from the orbit, but here in case of ox it is on the root of the limit of that forms the caudal boundary or the zygomatic process of frontal bone. So this is one of the major differences here, and one more difference will be there, that the horn core that is present in case of horn core present in case of ox is absent in case of horse. If you look out the same bone in case of dog, so in case of dog you can see here, this is the frontal bone, this and this. So this is one frontal bone, this is the other frontal bone in case of dog, and almost it resembles like that of the horse. You can see here, and supraorbital is very short, it is not complete. This is the caudal boundary is not formed, it is up to here only, supraorbital process. In case of dog it's not complete, usually there will be a supraorbital ligament, because the caudal boundary of the orbit in case of dog is incomplete and they are joined by the orbital ligament here. And sometimes the ethmoid foramens are two in number. So here you can see that two ethmoid foramens in case of dog, one is here and other is here. So two ethmoid foramens, then this is incomplete, supraorbital process is in the form of very small and it doesn't reach up to the frontal process of the zygomatic bone to complete the orbit. So these are 2-3 differences between the animals. Thank you.